This presentation is on the earliest ancestral Apache because the earliest Apachean groups in the area were different than modern-day Apache or those in the later historic period. We have to consider changes through time, and we also have to consider differences between Apachean groups, for example, the Chiricahua and the Mescalero. These differences are based in part on who their neighbors were, and also when they arrived, the route by which they got here, where they ended up, and how they lived, and so on. I want you to understand the ancestral Apache from an archaeological standpoint and how the evidence and arguments differ from what you may have read or heard before. I'm going to provide the latest information on the earliest ancestral Apache in the southernmost American Southwest. I want to present the chronometric dates of the earliest presence of these groups, for example, in the AD 1280 to 1300 period. I want to convey how we know that this material culture and these dates are in fact ancestral Apache, and how we have to think about the evidence and construct arguments differently than, for example, sedentary farming groups in the area. I want to convey the complexity of the arguments and the amounts and types of data that we have available. I'll begin with the routes of migration because this influences everything: how we frame the questions, how we explain the chronometric dates, and how we explain differences between groups. The original notion was that the earliest Apache came down the plains margin from the subarctic there in Canada, and also ultimately from Alaska. And then they looped in to the mountainous Southwest in what we know today as Arizona and New Mexico and Texas, and also the northern states of Mexico. When people in Canada and so on in the subarctic discuss ancestral Dene populations, they show this map showing the separation between those in the north and those in the south. And I'm focusing today on the area in the black circle here with the arrows in the southernmost portion of their distribution. When we talk about the ancestral Apache in the southernmost Southwest, we have to ask which Apache. And then we also have to ask when. So very early in time, we have Chiricahua Apache in the west. The earliest dates indicate this. And then we also have mountains and plains Mescalero and some Mescalero that used both zones. And then we also have the Lipan Apache on the plains and the plain margin. Now there's different behavior in the mountains versus on the plains and in the dual use zones. And that's what we try to capture as archaeologists, is this different behavior that we can see in the archaeological record, that we can see in the material culture. These differences are important to consider because different types of adaptations are required in the mountains versus on the plains, versus the dual use zone for those groups that went back and forth between the plains and the mountains. And then in the 1700s, the early 1700s, we have the Comanche pushing south, so the Lipan Apache go further south, including into Mexico, and they also, some of them are pushed west into the mountainous Southwest. The earliest dates that we have, as you can see by these black stars, are in the southernmost portion of the Southwest. These are dates that I have attained, and they demonstrate that the earliest Apachean groups were here by no later than AD 1300, perhaps the late 1200s. You can see the dates are quite widespread throughout 3 states, but importantly, this is where I've worked. So there's likely early dates elsewhere, and the further north you go, probably the earlier dates. But these are very early dates at the southern extent of the American Southwest to here in the United States. Now, these are exceptionally good dates, okay? They're taken on annuals, such as grasses and seeds for radiocarbon or C14 dates. And then I also have luminescence dates, thermoluminescence on burned rocks, for example, or pottery, fired pottery. And optically stimulated luminescence dates on pottery and other items like adobe and such. These dates are directly associated with ancestral Apachean material culture. That means that the samples are taken from contexts where I'm sure, based on other attributes, that it relates to the early Apache. Importantly, the southernmost position of these dates and these sites that they come from are explained by migration paths. They occur on both sides of the Rio Grande. Now, one reason for this, as you can see, is as ancestral groups move south, they move south on the east and the west of the Rocky Mountains and through sometimes the Rocky Mountains. But if they ended up on the west side, there was only so many places when they got this far south that they could get through the mountains. This is based on earlier studies that talk about the gateway culture and gateway pueblos that are at these passes that used to control access in the prehistoric period. And you can see by the gray arrows that there's only certain ways to get through. And these are the ways that the earliest migrating Apachean groups would have come through because there would have been least resistance. This explains the earliest dates south of the Four Corners area. And as you can see, they end up in the San Luis Valley. It's not that they couldn't get through in other places, they could, but this is what it looks like. And in some areas, they would have had to rappel down. It would have been very dangerous. So most of the people, especially with families and children and so on, would have come through other ways that were not so deeply cut by the rivers. We know that the ancestral Apache were here in the southern Southwest by AD 1300, probably the 1280s, or maybe even sooner, as you can see by the sites here. This is the San Pedro River Valley. We also have the Sabai-Priatham, the Jocome, the Hano, and others here at the same time. So there's this wide range of groups present, including the ancestral Apache, in the southern Southwest very early in time. And so all of these groups were important for the reorganization of the late pre-Hispanic period. All of them played a role. They were present when the cultures that we know about, the Puebloan groups, the Hohokam and so on, were reorganized and moved out of some of their key occupational areas. I'd like to present how different migration paths affect the lifeway and the evidence of the Apachean groups that ended up in the southernmost Southwest. I'm going to use housing as an example. Here in the southernmost Southwest, between Arizona and New Mexico, are the Peloncillo Mountains. And in this area, there are several early Apache sites. And I'm going to present on one of these that conveys a wide range of information and illustrates beautifully the way that these arguments for the earliest Apache are constructed. There are many early and later Apache sites in the southernmost Southwest. Many people suggest that Apache sites are rare, difficult to find. They are, in fact, difficult to find, but we know of thousands of them. I personally have recorded hundreds of them. So there are lots of them present, but not all of them provide the level and quality of data that this Peloncillo Mountain site does. This is an example of the types of data that can be obtained from some of these larger sites. So what we have indicated by the stars are places where Apache pottery was found. We have Apache wickiups. We have rock shelters with platform caches or storage features. We have water catchment features, and we have Apache rock art. We also have a number of chronometric dates that were obtained from features from contexts within the site that provide a really good record of when the site was used. These are illustrations of wickiup rings, a range of them found on this particular site and across the whole landform that the site is on. And as you can see, they're as variable as the terrain. These hut rings don't look one way. They're improvised. They're using the landscape, the terrain, and the materials available to them at these specific locations. And importantly, mobile group housing is similar throughout the West. The Apache way of making houses is similar to the Hakome way of making houses, is similar to the way mobile people throughout the world make their housing. So we have to use other attributes found in the archaeological record to distinguish between Apache house rings and Hakome house rings, for example, in this area. Now, the Wikiup rings that I've defined and have attributed to the Apache have been verified at historically referenced sites. And what I mean by that is places that are mentioned in the historical record or where there's photos and so on. So we know specifically that the Apache were at those locations. And in those locations, I've compared the on-the-ground evidence, the material culture, to historical texts and photos. One good example of this is Canyon de los Embudos, which is where Geronimo attempted to surrender. And at this place, the photographer C.S. Fly took some photos showing not only the Apache themselves, but the terrain and the housing. And we can find these locations on the ground. And so we see what the Wikiup clearings and rings look like, and we also can see the material culture that goes with that. Sometimes it's just European artifacts that dominate, although there are other artifacts, flagstone and pottery and other things like that. Now, houses come in several forms. So I've created these generalized structural types for the area. Sometimes, if the ground was free of rocks, they gathered up cobbles and made a circle, a rock-ring circle. In other cases where the ground was rocky or gravelly, they made a clearing and then pushed that up around the edges to form the edge of the house. They may have built their structures in a cobbly or boulder area where they just added a few cobbles or boulders to fill in the intervening areas. We see these throughout the Chiricahua and Mountain Mescalero areas, and they're very common, and once you've learned to see them, you can see them quite readily. At the Peloncillo mountain site, this is what they look like. In the upper right, we see adjustments or additions to boulder outcrops. And on the lower right, we see the clearing of a rocky surface, pushing rocks aside. And then the lower left, we see how it looks when they arrange rocks that form alignments, clear alignments around the outside. And as I said, these are characteristic of most mobile groups. This is a behavioral thing. Mobile people throughout the world build this way. And in this case, there's a broken Apache brownware vessel situated around the outside of the structure, so we know this one is Apache. Apache Wikiup or housing rings are arranged with reference to the natural attributes of the terrain. So their layout is not structured like it is, for example, on Subipriatum houses, where houses are paired, they're arranged in rows, and it's a predictable, planned type of settlement. But for the Apache, where they placed their structures was highly variable. Where they were located was dependent on flat areas of the terrain, where there was shelter, and so on, a variety of different factors. And so they're scattered sometimes willy-nilly throughout the area and are not arranged in any one predictable way. An early archaeologist, Louis Benford, suggested that activities for mobile people were centered around the housing. But he was looking at groups in the Arctic, and there, because it's very cold, they were tethered to their housing during the cold winter months. But here in the American Southwest, most of the activities, in fact, very few of them, except for some that might have been occupied in inclement weather, most of the activities are located 50 or even 200 yards away, where, for example, you might find a suitable place for grinding, or you might find a better place for sitting in the sun or shade, depending on the time of year, for working flakestone and so on, or where you might have had a line of sight to see if enemies were attacking, or a view to the lookout that might be further up on the hill slope and so on. You can read about some of these things in the articles that I'm bringing up here on the page. Many of these Wikiup rings or house rings are difficult to see. No doubt, they definitely are. In this case, it's quite small. It's only about a meter or a yard across. And sometimes These are situated on bedrock, so they have no depth. As you can see in the photo on the left, the flagging tape marks the location of flagstone artifacts in this case. So this particular structure had activities that occurred in the house. The type of housing changes through time and across geographic space. And it's important to understand this because this is one of the reasons why Apache archaeology was so difficult to define here in the mountainous Southwest, because everybody was looking for teepee rings. And teepees are iconic for the Apache, okay? But they only occur in the mountains very late in time, whereas on the plains, they're early in time. This is partially because teepees occur mostly on flattish land. Wickiups you can put in quite a number of places, but teepees, they have to be on relatively flat ground. Also, because of their lifeway, it was important not to have their housing be visible from a long distance off. And skin teepees and canvas-covered wickiups and so on are visible for miles away. So if they used locally available material, they could camouflage themselves from enemies much better, and they were less likely to be attacked. The same reasoning is at play in the difference between a conically shaped high-profile teepee and a dome-shaped, brush-covered wickiup. The shape itself helps camouflage the housing, especially when in rocky terrain. The other thing is, on the plains, you could pull the teepee poles and the fabric across the grassy plain with ease. But here in the mountainous Southwest, it's harder to do that because not only is it more rocky, but also a lot of steep, jagged slopes that have discontinuous pathways and so on. Now, what we see is in the mountains, very early on, you have wickiups. Archaeologically, we see this. And then on the plains, very early on, you have teepees. And sometimes you have teepees and wickiups there. In this intervening area, shown here, that's in the New Mexico area, you have both wickiups and teepees. And part of this is because this is where the reservation was. So you brought groups from different areas together, but also it's much later in time. Here's some images of teepees, some of which are partially on slopes, but you can see that's about the maximum slope. And in some cases, they're dug in or they have pegs or rocks around the edges to hold them down in the wind. There's a variety of teepee or rock ring shapes that we see on archaeological sites. As you can see here, it's quite variable, and this variation can be meaningful. It can suggest cultural differences. So if you just use a single rock ring to hold a structure down or to demarcate the boundaries, it may mean something different if you have a double ring. And that, in some cases, can be cultural. It also can indicate temporal differences. The size of these rings can indicate temporal differences. For example, early on the plains, dogs would pull travois that were loaded with teepee poles and the hides that formed the outside of the teepee. And therefore, the teepees were fairly small in circumference. Later in time, when they had the horse, the size of the teepee and the size of the pole could increase. And we see this change through time in some instances. So they had larger structures through time, in part because they had larger beasts of burden. Also, seasonal differences. If you're just staying a summer night, you might not even need a shelter. In certain cases, if you're staying during the winter, you're going to want to build a very substantial structure that can resist the wind and also so that it's warmer inside. So you might have a double circle of rocks. The amount of time that they intended to stay in a location was also important because you're going to potentially build more substantial structures if you're going to stay for a longer period of time, or if you're going to come back year after year. We see this in the material culture assemblages related to this, the artifacts and so on, where you're going to get more artifacts the longer you stay, or the greater number of seasons that you come back and so on. Now, this is what some of the teepee rings on the plains look like. This is on the Llano Estacado in southeast New Mexico. And some of them are quite substantial, as you can see on the lower right. And in other cases, there's just a few rocks. And in those cases, they're very difficult to define. One, because when they pulled up the fabric for the teepee, the rocks were dispersed and it ruined this really nice pattern that you can see. In other cases, rocks were placed only on one side of the teepee because of the direction of the wind, so that it would hold the teepee in place and they didn't need to put rocks all the way around. How do we know that the ancestral Apache occurred this far south, this early? And I'm talking about maybe even the late 1200s. And this is 3 to 4 centuries earlier than many scholars have thought. I'm going to use a very specific type of feature to convey how we know this. And I'm going to show how this feature type fits into the Apache lifeway. I'm going to show how I've been able to distinguish and date the ancestral Apache from other groups by showing you a feature that is unique to the mountain Apache. This particular type of feature occurs in rock shelters, and in the past, people have suggested that they were a sweat lodge, that it wasn't Apache, that perhaps it was a burial, but none of these things are true. In fact, they're platform caches. They're storage features that have ocotillo and other items in them when they're not too disturbed, so you can see the structure. Here is a schematic drawing of a platform cache. And these have been verified through excavation and recording. There's multiple examples known, and 2 of them seem to have stored material. A layer of ocotillo, yucca stalks, or juniper were placed down, and then rocks were placed around the perimeter to hold those in place. And then grass, yucca leaves, or oak leaves have been found on top of this to hold a basket, to hold a ceramic vessel in place, and to wick off moisture for food stuff that might be stored there. These are one of the most diagnostic Apache-specific features for the Chiricahua and Mescalero. This is where they stored items. There's no depth. They put it on top of this, and the air came up and helped keep it dry, and then it was covered over, in many cases, with rocks to keep it from being looted by other groups at the time, and also to keep the rodents out. Caching was an important part of the Apache lifeway, just as it was for mobile people in general, and it's important to the raiding lifestyle. And this is because caches are nodes of reliable and clustered resources. They reduce risk. They're situated along known routes and in areas where certain local groups or families expected to return seasonally year after year. They could rely on these resources when other sources of food or clothing or whatever were lacking. These were tucked into caves or rock shelters. We know how the Apache used them because we have quotes out of later documents and so on by Apaches. It says, "We harvested food as we went, and we stored surpluses in caches, preferably in caves near a water supply. If our people were forced to flee, they used these reserves." So there's lots of references in the historic documents and in ethnographic accounts and so on. Caches were very important in Apache subsistence because naturally occurring seasonally available resources were unpredictable and they varied. Okay, so the time of ripening might vary from year to year, or the best gathering locations, for example, for piñón might vary from year to year. And so if they couldn't get access to certain places, they needed to rely on their stored resources. Especially later in time, resources had to be obtained from areas that were under the control of enemies, and therefore their access was restricted. We read about this in historic documents and ethnographic accounts and land claims documents. Also, while the Apache depended on raiding, as did all groups from at least the 1500s onward, we read about it in the Cabeza de Vaca documents. Everybody was raiding their neighbors. But the Apache specifically, especially in the later periods, raiding resources was part of the known adaptation. But raiding resources could be inconsistent, and you couldn't rely on the kinds of results that you might need. The success of raiding depended on the presence of a pack train, the lack of successful resistance from a rancho, or that your raiders, your warriors, accurately surveilled a town that actually had something of value to take. When a rancheria was attacked, all was lost. Either the Spaniards, the Mexicans, the Americans, they either destroyed everything or they took it all. There's all kinds of references about the whole rancheria being burned and everything in it, or the soldiers or warriors or whomever taking what was left for their own use. After these attacks, caches provided much needed supplies to Apache groups. We know from ethnographic and historic records what was stored in these locations. We know that food was, and in some cases it was bundled up in hides and so on to keep it safe from rodents and so on. But they stored cooking utensils like pottery and so on, blankets, calico, firearms and so on. So a wide range of things might be cached in these locations. How do we know that these platform caches are ancestral Apache? There are many groups present at the same time, and so it's important that we understand that they specifically relate to and were made by and used by the Apache. As archaeologists, we use their distribution, the chronometric dates derived from them, and the associated material culture to make these assessments. These are the basic building blocks of archaeological inference. Now we can look at their distribution across the Southwest, and we see that they occur across many pre-Hispanic culture areas. So they're not pre-Hispanic, that is pre-Apache, nor are they any one of these specific groups. They occur in the Mogollon area, they occur in the Hohokam area, and so on. So it's some group that spanned this whole area, and one of the few groups that did that was the Apache. The dates, the chronometric dates corroborate this. We have dates that span the pre-Hispanic period all the way into the historic period. The only group that occupied all of these areas throughout this whole period were the ancestral Apache. Now this is, again, the Peloncillo mountain site, and I'm going to show you what's in various of these rock shelters. The rock shelter is indicated in the red circle here. And in this particular one, there's a storage feature that's been somewhat disturbed by deer and other large animals sleeping inside of it. But it has an Ocotillo base with grass on top, and I dated the grass that was hooked under the rocks there to AD 1640 to 1660. The dates are good. They're on annuals, radiocarbon date on annuals, meaning grasses, that are attached by boulders and cobbles sitting on top. I'm dating the use of the feature, when that grass was put in place. This particular rock shelter has another one of these features, and as you can see, it has juniper branches and Ocotillo on the base, and also yucca leaves. And in this case, the date was taken on the yucca leaf, and it came out with multiple intercepts, which basically is the curve crosses at several places, and it's hard to distinguish between those specific dates. And this particular rock shelter has also a date obtained on a yucca stalk. And the important thing about this is it not only has one of these features that's been disturbed, but it also has a gahi, mountain spirit, charcoal drawing on the back of the rock shelter. And this also tells us that it's Apache. Within, we also have a worked piece of a yucca stalk that could very well be a wand. We know that some of the dry caves have had headdresses in them. This has been reported. And also, I've had an ethnographer to the Mescalero Apache tell me that it was implied to him that these were ritually retired Gahi headdresses. Okay, so those types of things tend to be stored in these kinds of settings as well. This rock shelter has wasp-waisted pictographs in association with a storage platform. Wasp-waisted pictographs are widely known to be associated with Apachean groups throughout the region. In this case, you can see them on the back of the rock shelter, and they're in red paint, perhaps showing even Spaniards with hats on there. And the date is on the outer rings of a large piece of wood that was found in this particular setting. These types of features are found throughout a broad area. This is the westernmost one that I have recorded, and it has Apachean rock art in association with a platform cache in the Dragoon Mountains. And so they're widespread. They were used by different kinds of Apache, different groups of Apache, different Apache bands throughout a broad area. This is one of the ways that we know that they're Apache. We have really good associations between Apache rock art, Apache material culture, and so on, and exceptional dating contexts. What's really interesting about this is that we see differences between Apachean groups in the style of headdresses in rock art, for example, on the plains versus the mountains. On the plains, you have wind gods represented by bison horns, and in the mountains, you have mountain spirits indicated by deer-like headdresses, or later in time, perhaps stylized elk antlers. We see this throughout Arizona and New Mexico and on part of the plains. And of course, on the plains, you have wind, and in the mountains, you have lightning and thunder. And so you have different representations in these areas. In the reservation area, where you had groups from the plains and the mountains coming together, you have both mountain spirits and wind gods. And then through time, you have a change where you start getting the elk-looking headdresses that may represent not only the merging of people, but also elk moving from the plains into the mountains. Now, we know this is Apachean material culture, and in this case, we have Apache brownware in association with these storage platforms. Here's an example where we have a storage platform in one rock shelter, and right below it is Apache brownware. And these particular sherds were dated to the period that is consistent with other dates on this site. Again, this Wikiup ring here has Apache pottery, Apache brownware pottery outside the rim of the house, and so a vessel broke in this location. I've been mentioning brownware, Palencia brownware, because in this part of the American Southwest, pottery is made with brown clay. And so therefore the pots are brownwares. Even if they are low-fired and look gray, they're still brownware pottery. And so we have these various vessels here, whole vessels that have been found here in the southernmost Southwest, including in the Tres Hermanos Mountains, the Sacramento Mountains in the middle, and Otero Mesa on the right, with this distinctly Apache base on these. Not all Apache are the same. And in this case, this is a site from north of the Gila, and you can see that the pottery is very different. And so this is a site that not only is an Apache site, but it's also got Pi occupants and also probably trade with the Pi populations that were a little bit further west. And you can see the pottery is quite different. In fact, some of it's brownware and some of it's grayware, depending on where the pottery came from and what clay was used. But this is very different than what we see to the south. And contrary to what people have thought in the past and what you find in portions of northern New Mexico and on the plains, the pottery is not micaceous. There are many examples of brownware pottery related to Apachean groups in the southern Southwest as early as the 1400s. And while there is natural mica in the clay, it is not micaceous in the sense of mica being added or having such mica-rich clays being used. You can really see the difference here. We have other ways of knowing that these sites we're finding are Apache. For example, here's a teepee ring that we recorded, and we recorded a series of these outside the reservation boundary near Mescalero. And you can see that what we found is glass artifacts or stone artifacts related to the reservation period that are dead ringers for ones that are found on much earlier ancestral Apache sites. And so these similarities in style through time tell us that these are Apache, and they tell us also that they had similar tasks that they were undertaking using these types of tools. These storage platforms are related to the Apache use in the area, and we are as certain as we can be as archaeologists because of an extensive amount of work that has been undertaken. For example, they co-occur with clearly Apache rock art in the same rock shelter. These platform caches co-occur with Cerro Rojo complex stone tools, meaning stone tools and the lithic assemblage that has been defined as being ancestral Apache throughout the greater Southwest. And they're found in the same rock shelters as these platform caches. These platform caches occur in proximity to Apache pottery. They co-occur on the same sites as Apachean structures. They're found throughout Apache territory, including Mescalero and Chiricahua territory when it's in the mountains. They cross-cut or overlap several pre-Hispanic culture areas. So they're not these pre-Hispanic cultures such as Hohokam and Mogollon, but rather they represent a group, meaning the Apache, that was in all of these areas throughout the whole southern Southwest. And they have dates in the historic periods as well as dates in the terminal pre-Hispanic period. And there's no other mobile group that persisted for the entire length of time that these features were used based on the dates we have across this entire area, other than the Apache. So, how to interpret the evidence of these luminescence and AMS radiocarbon dates? We have dates from this site that go from basically the late 1400s all the way into the 1800s. So how do we interpret these? We know from understanding the Apache lifeway that these represent multiple visits. If we assume a single period of use, then we would have to say something like 1580 to 1710 or so. But we don't assume this because this is not the way the Apache used the landscape. They came and went. And so what we have represented here by these storage features is we have small Apache groups coming, depositing material, adding grass and so on, adding perhaps ocotillo or whatever, leaving it, coming back another time, taking the material out, then adding more material later and changing out the grass perhaps. So what we've got is a sequence of coming and going, of use, different uses through time by the same groups or sometimes different groups, and often groups who are descended from the original groups. These were their family storage areas in many cases. We have a site in southern Arizona called the Three Sisters site in the Dragoon Mountains that has 3 housing features, wickiup rings and a lean-to, and some fire pits and caches and so on. And at this site, I obtained a couple of different dates, AD 1300 and AD 1400. And is really important here because I'm not assuming that there was one long continuous occupation. What I'm assuming is that this small family group, consistent with ethnographic accounts of how they lived, came to this location seasonally to exploit the resources, and then went back to the local group location where more people were gathered. And the dates represent this coming and going seasonally. Now, they're also based on, the C14 date is based on the sugary material that leaked out of what they were cooking in the fire pit. So it's basically an annual. And So it means it's a really good date. And the thermoluminescence date was based on one burned rock out of one of the fire pits. And so what we have is we've captured 2 dates from a sequence of uses. And if I dated more material, I would expect additional dates that differ from these because these features were used over and over again. We also have very early evidence on the plains margin at the Cerro Rojo site in the Hueco Mountains in New Mexico. This is the largest ancestral Apache site known. It has 200 structures, and it dates, I ran at least 20 dates, I forget exactly how many. It dates from the 1400s into the 1800s, so this place was used over and over and over again. I've interpreted it as a multi-band gathering area because there's clusters of housing in different parts of the site. They're in suitable locations on the terrain, but also they're spatially separated. So they're probably distinct groups who came to the area occupying this seasonally. This was used for centuries, like I said, and it was such an important location because it was high elevation, it had defensive features, and it was far enough away from the river settlements that they could build huge fires and the kids could scream and yell and they could hold ceremonies and such without fear of being attacked. And this is the kind of multi-band gathering location that's mentioned in early historic documents and some ethnographies. This is where men, women, and children and old people would come together and be safe from a variety of different groups. This is probably the most important site I have ever found, at least in relation to the indigenous people of the Southwest. On this site, there's a variety of brownware sherds and so on related to vessel breakage. And again, these are brownwares that represent the ancestral Apache. But we also have probably a mixture of various Apachean bands. We may have Mescalero and Lipan Apache here. And also, there's clear evidence that non-Apache mobile people were here as well. In fact, this is the place where I defined the Canutillo complex, which is the non-Apache people, the Hano, Hakome, and Suma in particular. I also think there's Monzo represented here. The artifacts shown on the right here represent the Apache assemblage, including side-notched projectile points and a variety of tool forms that have been recorded, replicated at a number of different Apache sites. And so that's how we know that they are, in fact, representative of the Apache as opposed to any of these other groups. In fact, these flakestone artifacts of these other groups look very, very different. Here's a site that overlooks El Paso, and it dates to the 1700s and is characterized by 40 wickiup rings and a very much later flakestone assemblage. It has not only Apachean pottery on it, but it also has this broken vessel was found just below it, and it represents the type of pottery used by the mission natives, the non-Apache and sometimes Apache natives that occupied the mission settlements along the Rio Grande. So Apache could have taken it from one of their settlements there or one of the other groups that came to visit or whatever, or it could be related to a raid of those mission settlements. Once again, this is a relatively large site that represents a coming together of people who might move around the landscape in smaller groups for much of the year, but they came to this location seasonally, or for specific events, or ceremonies, or planning. So it's not a continuous occupation. So to conclude, Chiricahua and Mescalero Apache sites are routinely being found. They are difficult to find, but we now know how to find them, and we have so many that it's just a routine activity to find them. We can predict where they're at, okay? We can predict their location because we're looking at human behavior and we're looking at Apache-specific behavior to suggest where they might be, and then we go and then we find them there. We have these new feature types, such as the platform caches, that have been recently identified that help us date the Apache presence because they have grass and wood and so on in them that help us date. And they're gathering areas, so we sometimes have broken pottery that we can date as well. But we have, we're still learning, and we have new feature types like these platform caches that are only recently defined. What's really important about this too is that in the past, Apache sites could only be identified if they had reworked European artifacts on them. And you'd use metal detecting to find them often. But what that meant is that we could only date and find Apache sites during the time period when Europeans were present. And once we defined what the indigenous material culture assemblage looked like, meaning the flakestone artifacts and the housing and all that, then we could extend their presence back earlier in time and then date that and so on. So we have a continuous use that we can identify based on the native material culture from the pre-European times all the way into the later historic period when Europeans are present and they're using European material culture. So this is a real advantage we have now. We can date them much earlier because we understand what the sites look like without metal artifacts on them. Not all of the late dating sites are Apache. There were many other mobile groups present that we have to rule out. There were also outlaws that exhibited the same kinds of behavior, and these outlaws, not all of them were native. Many of them were Billy the Kid types and so on. So they used these hinterland areas in many of the same ways as Apaches who were trying to not be found and so on. This Apache signature differs through time. So early on, it looks different, and we can see it changing through time as types of material culture and so on are added, like when metal is added and so on, and as pottery changes through time. But also, the use of particular portions of the landscape changes through time for the Apache as well. And that's discussed in this article. We can see through time where early on, there were many Apache sites up high, and the earliest written records talk about being able to see smoke from miles and miles away. Whereas about 1860, they had to move down in elevation and occupy areas where the smoke would be dispersed, like in hidden valleys where there were lots of trees and so on, because they were being pursued so bad. So we see a change in behavior as to where they put their sites through time. And if we understand that, then we can understand more about where to find the sites and how they had to adapt to those around them. The migration route taken influenced how ancestral Apache archaeology looks, how the Apache themselves behaved, as do later events and contacts with various people. And that's why we see differences between the Lipan Apache, for example, and the Chiricahua and the Mescalero, and groups that are north of the Gila, for example. Those actually look quite a bit different because there was a lot of agriculture. And so as a result, the site placement, the nature of the houses, and the kinds of artifacts they had varied to some degree. We have hundreds of carefully selected dates to make these claims of the presence of the earliest Apache. The dates might have actually extended further back in time, but I stopped dating because it was my personal money in many cases that was being used, and I felt satisfied that I got it back far enough in time. It was very hard work, but I have hundreds of carefully selected dates. I have multiple dates, multiple contexts, and multiple sample types: luminescence, radiocarbon, on pottery, on burned rocks, on grass, on yucca, and so on, that kind of thing. These are in direct association with Apache distinctive material culture. In other words, there are other ways of assessing that it's Apache, and then I date it. And so these are exceptionally good dates that these inferences are based on. And you can go to these sources, among others, to read more about what's discussed in this presentation.